My guest at this time is Virginia Republican Delegate Nick Freitas. He joins me now to discuss the special session that's about to begin in the Virginia legislature, ordered by Virginia Democratic Governor Ralph Northam to address gun violence. The governor himself has very specific ideas, including bans on assault weapons and mandatory background checks and so forth. But what will the Republican majorities in the legislature be pursuing over the next few days here? And Delegate Freitas, thanks so much for your time today.
Oh, pleasure to be on. Thanks for having me, Greg.
Well, you and I talked about what was likely to be happening here when Northam declared the special session a number of weeks ago. You said this was more about burnishing his political standing than any concrete policy proposals that would actually reduce gun violence. So what will you and your Republican colleagues be focusing on as a part of this special session?
Well, I'm going to hold to my original analysis there. I think as we look at the legislation that he's suggesting and that he called this special session for, there's absolutely nothing that he is proposing that would have prevented what happened in Virginia Beach. And that's not coming from me. That's coming from the police chief in Virginia Beach. And surprisingly enough, it's also coming from Governor Ralph Northam, who shared that same sentiment when he was talking to a group not too long ago. So, again, it kind of begs the question that if the governor is acknowledging that none of these gun bills that he's suggesting would have prevented Virginia Beach, then why was it necessary to call a special session to hear them? This is basically a lot of retreads of previous anti-gun legislation that they've suggested. They've gone through a deliberative committee process before, and now he's calling us in a special session for this. So I think that, again, when you consider what it is that he's suggesting and the manner in which he's doing it, it's hard for me to come to any other conclusion than this is more about Governor Northam trying to, again, run away from his, Ku Klux Klan and blackface scandal than it is about genuinely trying to go through a good and deliberative process to determine how we stop violence. I will say that as with any piece of legislation that ever comes before me, and I sit on the Militia, Police, and Public Safety Committee, which is the one that hears gun legislation, I'm going to read through the bills, I'm going to listen to testimony, and I'm going to make a decision based off of two things. And one has to do, obviously, with the public safety component, because I do believe that's a legitimate function of government. And then the other side is going to be about protecting people's civil liberties. And one of the most frustrating things to see in all of this, Greg, is legislation which, as you stated before, and I certainly agree with, legislation that does not prevent gun violence, but does do quite a bit to expand government's power in preventing law-abiding gun owners from being able to, have access to the means to be able to defend themselves. So I think, again, the House Republicans, the Senate Republicans, we are dedicated toward giving each bill a fair hearing and taking testimony, but ultimately very frustrated with the approach that the governor used on this, and then the governor's attempts to try to dictate terms to the legislature as if we're not a co-equal branch of government with respect to how this special session should go. But again, I'm very confident that we're going to look at this legislation, and we're going to be able to, one, recommend our own legislation which genuinely protects public safety while at the same time protecting constitutionally protected rights and people's civil liberties.
Get a little more specific on that, because obviously you have to have the session, but you don't have to do what the governor wants, particularly since your party controls the legislature narrowly in both chambers, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But when it comes to public safety and protecting civil liberties, what kind of legislation do you and your colleagues have in mind?
Well, I know I've looked at legislation where we've essentially said that if an employee, if somebody that's working at a government agency or at a government building specifically states that they fear for their physical safety because of another employee or because of someone that regularly frequents it, and then they request to carry a firearm legally, then I think that the local agency should have the authority to be able to grant them that request. If they deny that request, and that individual ends up getting hurt, then I think it's fair to assume that the agency itself should share some of the civil liability with respect to that person getting hurt. Because, again, you're creating a situation where somebody has to use that facility, has to use that government facility. That employee has expressed a concern, and this actually happened in Virginia Beach, has expressed a concern, has requested that they be allowed to defend themselves. And it was the agency which essentially shut them down as a result of their anti-gun policy. And so I think when that happens, the government is civilly liable for damages. And so I think that's one thing to look at in order to encourage these local government buildings to either beef up their security or at the very least not deny people the ability to provide for their own security. I think some of the other things that we've looked at before, and we certainly tried to get past this last session. In fact, there was one bill that was suggested by a Democrat that we supported, which says that if you're a repeat domestic abuser, because obviously we know that sometimes firearms are misused in domestic violence cases. If you're a repeated domestic abuser, well, then you should have to spend some time in jail, so that the victims of your abuse actually have time to be able to make arrangements for their own safety, to be able to move. And the governor vetoed it. So I think our entire approach to public safety is very different. We look at an approach to public safety which protects civil liberties by putting the emphasis on the action. Whereas too many on the left have made this purely a question of how do we engage in what they believe to be our preventative measures, but in reality are simply transferring more authority and power to the government at the expense of individual liberties and civil liberties. And I'll give you a perfect example of this. The red flag laws are incredibly popular right now with people on the left and even some on the right. But if you look at what a red flag law actually does, is it says that if someone lodges a complaint against you to a magistrate, and that magistrate goes to a judge, and the magistrate and the judge agree that you're a threat, they can confiscate your firearms. So think about that for a moment. You haven't been arrested. You haven't been convicted. You haven't had a trial with a jury of your peers. You haven't been able to formulate your own defense. You haven't been able to face your accuser. Essentially, you've been denied all access to due process of law. And now both your Second Amendment and your Fourth Amendment rights are going to be infringed upon because two government officials unilaterally decided you were a threat. I want you to imagine if we applied that same logic to, say, the First Amendment. What if we had a bill coming from the left that essentially said that, sometimes media organizations put out bad information which leads to a violent reaction or it leads to people doing inappropriate things. Therefore, as long as two government officials have determined that your newspaper or your media outlet is a threat to public safety, is a public health crisis, then we're going to go ahead and dispatch with your First Amendment rights without any other due process of law. I mean, I hope that all liberty-loving citizens would recognize what a huge threat that is to liberty, what a huge potential abuse of power that is, and would reject it. Well, if we can see how bad that would be for the First Amendment, I would hope we could also see how bad such policies would be for both the Second and the Fourth Amendment as well.
We're talking with Virginia Republican Delegate Nick Freitas. And Delegate Freitas, it's a very narrow majority in both the House and Senate, 51-49 in the House, 21-19 in the Senate. And every one of those 140 seats are on the ballot this November, and some of those are very tight districts. The Democrats came very close to taking back the House in 2017. They didn't do it, and obviously, if they can't get the legislation they want done, they at least want the issue for the fall campaign. Do you fear that some of the folks in competitive districts might be willing to go with some of the gun control proposals as a matter of political expediency, or do you feel like your caucus is pretty well lined up here?
I think our caucus is going to hold strong. I certainly hope that it does. I think that, again, when you look at this from an empirical standpoint and when you look at it from a logical standpoint and a moral standpoint, it does not make sense to pass legislation which is, again, going to deny people basic civil liberties without providing for any greater protection, that is going to potentially turn tens of thousands of law-abiding Virginia citizens into felons simply because of a high-capacity magazine they might happen to own. Not to mention the fact there's a lot of other legislation that would be incredibly difficult to enforce, if not impossible, without massive government expansion. So I think that when we look at the arguments associated with this, I think it makes sense on an empirical, a logical, and a moral grounds to oppose some of the policy prescriptions that are being sent to us. But again, I think obviously when you get into an election year, some people get nervous, and that is really where it is on constituents to sometimes provide additional encouragement to their legislators to do the right thing, especially those people that have recognized these laws as being problematic in the past. Well, if they were problematic in the past, nothing has changed since we last met in session to suggest that they're now effective. They still carry the same problems without producing, without producing any of the positive results the constituents have been promised. So I would just really encourage people that if you value your civil liberties, if you value your ability to be able to protect yourself, to be able to protect your family, you need to encourage your legislators to stay strong. But at this point, I'm confident that we will. And look, I want to clarify something here too. I'm going to listen to each piece of legislation. I'm going to listen to testimony. That's going to get a fair hearing. But I think, again, another big part of the problem here is that instead of going through the standard legislative process, the governor called a special session for a bunch of bills that he admits would not have done anything to prevent Virginia Beach. So this should have gone through the regular legislative process instead of him, politicizing this event and really politicizing a tragedy. And I think that's something else too that we need to look at going past this is fighting against this tendency for politicians, especially politicians that want to expand the power and scope of government, constantly exploiting tragedies for their own political benefit.
Last question here, Delegate Freitas, and I'm guessing you've probably seen this survey, but Christopher Newport University released a poll on July 3rd showing pretty strong support for, first of all, requiring background checks on all gun sales. 84% support that. 76% oppose concealed carry without a permit, and there's a 65-34 gap in favor of banning assault-style weapons. And some folks might have a different idea of what that terminology means than others. But obviously, as you've explained, the Constitution trumps polls. But what do you make of where the public is on this?
Well, I think, again, they're doing very convenient polling right after a tragedy, and then they're polling based off of the intention of bills as opposed to what they actually do. And this is one of the things that whenever I'm talking to constituents, whenever I'm talking to students, I always emphasize to them, do not judge a piece of legislation based off of the stated intentions of its legislator. You have to judge a bill based off of what it actually does, the letter of the law, and then you have to judge it by its results. And I think what we see is time and time again, when we pass greater restrictions on people's ability to keep and bear arms, we don't create safer communities. So again, it fails the empirical test. And then I think when we also look at the stated intentions, and this is something that has been a real problem with the media. I've heard the red flag laws described by the media as a suicide prevention bill, as if that's what it does. With no mention of the absolute abysmal rules contained within that legislation, which again allows for massive government expansion and complete ignoring of people's Second Amendment and Fourth Amendment rights. So I think that, again, there's some education of the public that needs to go on here. When we talk about assault weapons, again, most people, they hear assault weapon, they think that we're talking about an M240 Bravo machine gun or something like that. They don't realize that when the left talks about an assault weapon, they mean a semi-automatic rifle. That can be any number of things that I don't think most people would categorize as a quote-unquote assault rifle if they actually knew what we were talking about. And then when it comes to things like universal background checks, well, again, that makes sense to people until you actually get into the details of how they would carry that out. What that essentially means is that if I want to sell a gun to my uncle, well, now I have to go through a formal background check. Well, there's no way to actually enforce that unless you have universal gun registration. And what you see is the moment legislators start asking for universal background checks, that's the initial ask because they think that makes sense to people. And then following that will be universal gun registration. And then following that makes it far easier for the government to come in and actually confiscate your property as they pass more and more draconian gun laws. So again, some of this is an education component, but the thing I would like people to, once again recognize when they look at all of this, if you look at where some of the most draconian gun laws were in the United States, they were actually in the South. And I always bring this up because I'll hear people say all the time, well, why does someone need an AR-15 or why does someone need a semi-automatic pistol? Well, the reason why the South, the Jim Crow South, controlled by Democrats, passed a lot of these anti-gun bills was not because they wanted to get guns out of the hands of everybody. No, they wanted to selectively ensure that only people that the government approved of could get firearms. And that didn't mean law-abiding citizens versus criminals. That meant it provided an opportunity where the government down there could continue to oppress people based off of their skin color. And you had African-American communities that lived in fear of their Jim Crow South and law enforcement agencies, of their government, of the Ku Klux Klan that was using violence against people, that was lynching people all throughout the South. And the Second Amendment was the one thing for many of those families that stood in between them becoming a victim and being able to defend their family. So I think it's important to remember that the reason why we have the Second Amendment is not for hunting. It's not for gun collecting. The reason why we have it is because we understand that each individual has an inherent right to be able to defend themselves. And unfortunately, it wasn't that long ago, even in this country, where people had to defend themselves from their own government. So I would just ask people to once again take a historical perspective on this and understand the value of the Second Amendment and why it's so important to protect it. There are a number of ways that we can deal with violence. There's a number of ways that we can deal with shootings that attack the behavior and don't attack people's Second or Fourth Amendment rights.
Delegate Freitas, you got a lot of work ahead of you in the next few days here. Tuesday, July 9th is when the session begins. And as you mentioned, you're on the committee where all of the different legislative proposals will be coming. So a lot of work for you and your colleagues there, as well as the entire General Assembly. Look forward to talking to you when all the work is done and see what has been decided there. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Greg.
Republican Virginia Delegate Nick Freitas. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.